Greetings, fellow explorers, and welcome to the 5th episode of Geekoscopy 101. It's the podcast show that explores the nexus between science, story, wonder, and philosophy. With me, your host, Dr. Yannis Kiston. And today, we are pondering the depths of history and the importance of conservation with none other than the LoFi historian himself, Garrett Eriksen. How are you doing, Garrett?
Good and yourself?
I'm doing really well. I'm really excited to chat to you tonight. We met through your conservation efforts with conservation streamers on Twitch.
Yeah.
And I've been keen to chat to you about it, being also a man of academics, delving into video games and streaming and online media and stuff like that. So speaking about that, tell us a bit about who you are in this moment and what you do.
Okay. Well, so yeah, as mentioned, my handle is LoFi Historian. It's my actual name is Garrett Eriksen. I'm currently completing my PhD in history. I mostly focus on the Cold War in Africa, so that period, and in particular, I focus on the South African border war and the veterans thereof. I'm very interested in veteran experiences, but I'm sure we'll get into that later. Other than that, I'm also someone who deals with animal conservation. I come from an animal conservation background. I've also grew up in South Africa, but I've been lucky enough to travel to several different countries around the world. I think my current count is 55. So I'm hoping one day to make it around. You know, I want to travel to every single country in the world at least once. And in that, I've also been to every single continent, including Antarctica, but excluding Australia. So Australia is big on my list to go to.
Really? You made it to Antarctica before you got to Australia. How did you manage that? How did you end up on Antarctica?
Sorry?
How did you end up on Antarctica?
Oh, so one thing my parents like to do a lot is to kind of chain travel. So if we're going to travel, we do it for about a month or two at a go, and we link up things. So even though I've traveled a few times for research or just for my own enjoyment, my family loves to do like nice family vacations. So I've been lucky enough that because they like in doing that, we sometimes get to see amazing places. And one of the places we went to was South America. We went to Brazil, Chile, Argentina, and that. And then if you continue down south of South America, you can end up on the cusp of Antarctica and down into some of the islands offshoots there. So we managed to go to the tip and the edge of Antarctica, as well as part of the mainland, and then back up. And obviously it is protected waters, especially these days. So it's very, very rare now to actually be able to go. You do have to book either through cruise ships or you have to be part of a research vessel. You can't just go there by yourself anymore.
I can imagine. Yeah, it's not for everybody.
No, exactly. But it's beautiful. I think it's one of my favorite places in the world. And it just so happens that I have a professional interest in it as well. Besides my main research interests, I have a slew of side interests, including African paleontology and archaeology and that. But one thing I'm very interested in is the potential future geopolitical situation of Antarctica, because I'm thinking ahead as global warming is happening, that new areas are going to open up as ice starts to melt and as lands start to recede because of the rising waters. So we're going to, I think, see a big interest in Antarctica becoming a potential new place to set up, depending on how the ice flows and such go. So anyway, but that's a separate story.
Well, Antarctica is one of the biggest deserts on the planet. There's nothing really happening. But
I'm sure people find something interesting there.
All you have to do is drill oil there, and then it's over. Somebody's gonna take it.
Exactly.
So, how did your love for then history come about, and what's your PhD work about?
So that's actually quite a funny tale in and of itself. I didn't start off to become a historian. I've always been interested in stories, though. So when I left school, I wanted to make documentaries. So I actually went to film school. And while I was in film school, I was really enjoying it. However, they were very set on teaching us to be advertisers first and filmmakers second. You know, there was kind of like, they said, you know, you can go and do your documentaries, but how you're going to make your bread and butter money is through advertisements. And I just was not about that life. I can't stand adverts. And I just said, no, I want to find a different way to do this. So I decided to go study journalism at Rhodes University. So I had to do a bridging course. I spent a year doing psychology and English studies through UNISA, then which is University of South Africa. For those who don't know, it's a correspondence university. Then through that, I got into Rhodes University. Then I spent a year doing journalism, English. I picked up history, and there was another subject which I can't recall. Classic civilization studies. So I had a few interesting subjects. And then I decided eventually actually to drop journalism, because as much as I was enjoying it, I found that they were offering a course, they were structuring it in such a way that by my fourth year, chances are I wouldn't have been able to actually do this course I wanted to, i.e. I wanted to do documentaries, and it sounded like that wasn't going to happen. So I decided, at that point, kind of everything was thrown up in the air. I'm like, oh, what can I do now? So I got into my second year, and I decided to continue. I picked up psychology again. I continued with history because it was always a fun side subject, and I carried on with classic civilization studies. And I thought now's the perfect time to go back to psychology, which I also enjoyed. And I started thinking maybe I'll go into criminology. I enjoy, working with people who have trauma, and I thought maybe there's a way I can help restructure the criminal system, etc. The criminal justice system. And in my third year, I read a book by, and I've forgotten her name, unfortunately, but she's a well-known South African author, also a criminologist, and studies serial killers in particular. And she wrote a book about her experiences. And the one chapter was detailing how she found a victim. They opened a barrel, and inside the victim had been stuck in this barrel for months in the hot sun, and had just liquefied and putrefied. And I was just like, no, I'm good. Moving on.
Straight up noped out of there.
Yeah. And so about third year, I had history and psychology. History had just crept up and just become this really interesting thing. And now I was debating dropping psychology. And then at that point, we started a new module in history about the South African border war. And I was like, what's this? I've never heard about this. And I was fairly familiar with South African history. I knew about apartheid. But at this point, I didn't know that South Africa had been involved in a war. I knew about the Anglo-Boer War, the Anglo-Zulu War, even World War I, World War II. But here was a war that had happened in Angola and South Africa and Namibia. Sorry, it involved South Africa, but it happened at the edge of Namibia and in Angola. During the time when my parents were alive, my parents are still alive, just to confirm. But during the time when my parents were young, and it was like the 70s, 60s, 80s, that area. And I realized I knew nothing about this, and it just blew my mind. And the more I learned about it, the more I realized that there are people walking around now who have been in this like 30 plus year long conflict who have not had their stories told. Like there were very, very few books about it, and there was like one or two courses. There was very little information about it. And I started realizing I can marry my study of PTSD from psychology and my interest in these war veterans and the stories into history. Because I had to start picking what I was going to do for honors, either psychology or history. And I decided to go with history. And my professor at the time as well was very interested in that angle that I was going for. So I decided, no, I'm going to be a historian. So I went into honors and I did history. And I started focusing on war veterans and their experiences and, certain battles and such. And while I was doing this, I decided, hang on, here's a perfect opportunity to do a documentary. So I recorded several veterans. I made a documentary about their experiences. And then I wrote a thesis component about this experience, as well as using the video as a primary source, basically. So I will say this: it was a very interesting experience. I really enjoyed it. I think I got amazing information out of it, information that hadn't been captured in that way before. This was before there were any big, there were several documentaries about the border war, but usually it happened during it or just after. There hadn't been one up until this point that really kind of covered it. Not the way I was doing it. And it was just a student project. It was only a half an hour long. So it's not even, I don't even have it on YouTube anymore because the DMCAs came around and took down all my music and everything. And I will say I didn't really get the best marks out of it because my very traditional history department didn't know how to market. But they appreciated the effort. However, what came out of that was about 6 months later, I got an invitation from Edinburgh University to come and do a master's course at their African Studies department, doing, a video documentary. Basically, they were running a pilot project where they wanted to see if people can do master's theses with a video component, exactly what I had done. So I came up there, and my supervisor was South African as well. And she was very big into African media studies. And combined with with her and another supervisor that was there, I created again another documentary with a written component, and I got my master's in political science through that. I did very well, got a distinction for it. So there was a big difference in reception. And that documentary is currently on YouTube. It's called Stories, Shadows, and Dust, if anyone wants to look it up. Again, it's a student project from back in 2011. So it's not the greatest quality, but
almost a decade. Yeah.
Yeah, right. I do want to do a follow-up one day with like better quality and everything, but that's much later. I have several ideas for documentaries I want to do in Angola, but that will be, after I finish the PhD and all the rest of it. So that's my journey to becoming a fully fledged historian. And then when I came back from Edinburgh in 2013, I worked for a year at my family's wildlife park, the Kanga Wildlife Ranch. And then I decided I want to do a PhD, and that was in 2014. And here I am, 7 years later.
That's a pretty cool story. You've been, I would say you have a lot of life experience going.
Yeah, tell me about it.
Not only through academia, but just like going around and traveling and stuff like that. So then what is your PhD work about?
Yeah, so as I mentioned, I focus mostly on war veterans. So for my honors thesis, I focused on the Battle of Quito Cuanavale, which is one of the most contentious battles of the South African border war. I wanted to deal mostly with how the veterans recall their experiences there. For my master's thesis, I took what I'd learned from there. I interviewed a couple of more people, spliced that footage with the old footage. And I focused then on how information is broadcasted from memories into like a diorama of a film medium. So it was very much almost like a film studies, psychology study, sociology, history study rolled into one with some African politics and things thrown in there. So very much a mishmash. I'm very big on multidisciplinary studies. I don't believe in history, politics. I mix everything if I can. Then I started thinking in 2013, because I was already, considering doing a PhD, and I contacted my supervisor here at Stellenbosch University, where I'm currently based, and I said, I'm interested. I read this book by, and if I always mess up her surname, but I believe it's Amanda Logson. She's a Australian academic who focuses on Australian soldiers in World War I. And I think World War II actually as well. And she did a big study on boredom in that era with Australian soldiers. And I started thinking, that's a good point. Like, after my thesis and a little bit later, more and more information started coming out about the South African border war. I mean, my bookshelf here, this is mostly border war books. And it's very big now. It's publishing a lot more. People are coming out and they're telling their stories more and more. And I started realizing that we always focus on the battles and the exciting bits, but what about when they're bored? What about when they're not fighting and they're sitting there and they're reading their letters from their loved ones and they're dealing with the trauma of shooting someone and they're getting drunk and they're smoking weed and they're gambling and all that stuff that doesn't get recorded? What about that? And that started my journey. So long story short, my thesis is on the recreational activities of South African Defence Force soldiers during the South African border war, effectively, and the boredom and interactions that surround that. So I look at, I've got an entire chapter, and this is, again, where my psychology background came in. I did a whole chapter on the psychosomatics and analyses of boredom as a concept, and then as in the military. And then I'm doing chapters on sports in the military, religion, alternative entertainment, which is anything from drugs and gambling to prostitution to a whole variety of things. And yeah, so I'm kind of going the whole spectrum. And then I was lucky enough to go with a group of veterans last year. I went to Angola with them. And we went on a 10-day journey to one of the big battle sites in Angola. And it's called the Battle of Lomba River. And it was the largest tank battle on the African continent since World War II happened there. So these guys had been in that battle, many of them their first time returning to that site. And I traveled with them to not only learn more about that site and the war in general, from the horse's mouth, so to speak, but to also learn more about the stuff they talk about, what they did in between, and they told so many different hilarious stories about, pranks that they pulled on each other and just different experiences. And they would, talk about the sports they played, the friends they made, all this stuff. So it was a gold mine of information for me. So I'm kind of splicing all that together.
Sounds pretty cool. Yeah, that multidisciplinary work you would have to do, especially in an academic context. But I'm really interested in first my one question about history, how do you split apart archaeology from history? Where's the line?
Right. Okay, yeah. So that actually, it's funny because archaeology and paleontology often get confused for each other. So paleontology is the study of dinosaurs and fossils, as I'm sure you know, and archaeology is the study of human remains and human items and such. And anthropology is a study of obviously human evolution, etc. So history is obviously more in touch with archaeology, and history is more of a contextual base. So let's say we discover, let's use something worldwide known like King Arthur's table. Let's say, something like that. We find King Arthur's resting place. So archaeologists will often have fairly good historical knowledge of an area, if not excellent historical knowledge of an area. And they will go and they will assess the location. They have the expertise to physically dig up, extract, remove, and manage the artifacts that come out of it. However, because they focused mostly on that, there's a wider historical context that they might not be aware of. So, for example, let's say it was found in Wessex, in England. I would then maybe, as a scholar who's very familiar with Wessex, I could tell them, you know this particular area because of your archaeological background. Let me tell you about the past 500 years, one way or another, from where you found it. Here's all the archive records. Here's all the, the documents we have. Here's all the tales from books. Here is poetry and, individual accounts. Here's even DNA studies that we have records of, etc. So a historian's job basically is storyteller and archivist. We provide context to the things that other people find. So, if an archaeologist finds this bottle, right, a bottle like this, they'll know where it was made, when, how, etc. I'll be able to provide the exact kind of history around it. Who would have likely drunk this? What was the economic circumstances around it? Who were the people who built the factory that made this? All that kind of context. So they will be at the center of the web. We will be all the connecting lines that get to it. There's a lot of interplay and interplay between the two areas. And often archaeologists will call historians in to help and vice versa. So it really just depends on what's found.
Yeah. So I suppose you guys act like a team.
To
try and find the whole picture out that each of you can't do by yourselves.
I just found in my archive research, I found an archaeological document that was a report written by the South African Defence Force soldiers in the 70s up in northern Namibia about an area they found, and they brought in some archaeologists to study that area. Now, I, as a historian, want to know more about this because it might impact my research. So I'm reaching out to some archaeologists to interpret this data and see if it's worthwhile for my context. And then maybe by sending them this, because it was classified, until I requested it declassified, it's been classified as a report since the 70s. So that means that there are archaeologists that are currently in South Africa who have never seen this report. So it would be great to hear from them if it's anything interesting.
That's pretty cool. I'm really digging the hole, like you have to kind of work together with these other scientists to do that, because you do get that a lot in biology as well.
Yeah, I can imagine.
Because it's also an interconnected science. If you're going from things like all the way from the genetic level to how animals behave, there's a wide spectrum of what can go on. But speaking about animals, you also have a love for conservation, and with your parents also owning a wildlife ranch. So tell us a bit about that journey through time.
Yeah. So the Kanga Wildlife Ranch is my family's endangered species. I don't want to say it's a reservation. It's an endangered species breeding facility and conservation facility. The idea behind our facility is first we have an education wing and we have a conservation wing. So the education wing is our tourism element. So that's when people come in and they go on guided tours in our facility. We teach them everything we know. We show them all the animals, lots of interactability. And we also have ambassador animal programs where they can interact with animals. And I'll get to that a bit later. And then we have our conservation side, which is our primary focus, obviously. And that is when we take animal bloodlines that maybe are thinning out or are struggling, for example, like the African cheetah, and we will breed stronger bloodlines, working together with international stud books and geneticists to ensure that populations are stronger around the world. We will send these stronger bloodlines as they're bred to other parts of the world to increase those bloodlines. We don't do live releases ourselves, but we send off cheetahs to facilities that do that. Given where we are, we don't have space to live release. But the Kanga Wildlife Ranch itself, it didn't actually start as a wildlife ranch. It started off as a crocodile farm. And my parents purchased it in 1986, shortly after I was born, actually. And over about 30 years now, I think we've just celebrated, our 33rd or 34th anniversary of the wildlife ranch. And they converted it into a world-class conservation facility. We are one of only, I think it's 2 or 3 facilities on the whole African continent that are both accredited by PASAB, which is the Pan-Africa Zoological Association of Botanical Gardens, and also members of the World Association of Zoos and Aquarium. So we wear that with pride. We're definitely up there, and so for me, as a child growing up, obviously, I grew up in the small town of Oudtshoorn. For those listening, if you want to know how to spell it, it's CANGO. So you can find us online, www.cango.co.za, or you can look us up on Facebook, Kango Wildlife Ranch. And sorry, just side fact, a bit of historical knowledge here. Kango is the Khoisan word for place of water. Because Oudtshoorn itself, though a semi-arid desert region, has big rivers and lots of underground water and lots of cave systems. So when the settlers arrived and they asked the Khoisan, what is this place called? They said Kango, which means place of water. So it's kind of in that area, there's lots of places that have that name, and we obviously are a bigger one that does. Anyway, so I grew up there, grew up working with animals and wildlife conservation. And many people do ask, why haven't I gone into animal conservation instead of history? And I have 2 answers to that. The first is that I do actually, one of my major side interests is ecological history. So even though in Angola, for example, I'm wanting to do more work there with the war veterans and about war, I'm also very interested in the ecological impact of warfare in an area, what it does to the surrounding ecology and animals, etc. So I'm marrying those kind of 2 things as well. And no matter where I go, I'll always be involved in the Kanga Wildlife Ranch, even if I'm busy doing my own thing. The other answer is that I've worked at the Kanga Wildlife Ranch my whole life. The moment I could stand up, I was there. In fact, there are photos, and if anyone sees them on my Facebook or if you go to my stream, actually, it's in my about panel. But there's a photo of me with a baby cheetah. My first friend was a cheetah called Alpha and a baboon called Stinky. My first 2 friends. So I was involved in animals from a super early age, and I worked there until I left school at the age of 18. And in between my studies, whenever I wasn't formally at a university, I was working at the Wildlife Ranch. So I've worked there the equivalent of about 20, 22 years. And I think many people, I know it's maybe the previous generation, it's frowned upon, but our modern generation, we're very much like, if you spend 10 or so years in a place, you usually end up moving on somewhere if you haven't, risen in the ranks. And obviously I had risen in the ranks, but I wanted to do something else. And I think that my parents had instilled such a love of knowledge in me from all our travels that I needed to learn more. I wanted to know more. And I found that history was the perfect avenue for me to do that. I could study anything I wanted through history. I wanted to know more about medical history, could do that. Astrophysics, could do that. Animal conservation, could do that. Whatever I wanted to, history had it all for me as far as I'm concerned. So my lust for knowledge took me in this direction. But I'll always be involved in animal conservation, and the Wildlife Ranch is still there. We've been having our troubles in lockdown, which is why we had the Conservation Streamers Initiative, which is where we're trying to raise funds to keep our animals fed and keep our staff paid. So we have over 4,000 individual animals, about 90 species, and 140 staff at our facility. So we were raising funds these past few months, and one of the ways I could contribute was through streaming. So we contacted a bunch of streamers. A big South African contingent came through, which was wonderful, as well as several international streamers as well. And they all came forward, and we just spent an entire weekend raising funds. In one weekend, we raised over 100,000 Rand, which was absolutely amazing. And then after that, I kind of got a taste for streaming, and I ended up getting involved myself and seeing I could use it as a platform to not only still talk about the Kanga Wildlife Ranch, but also, talk about animal conservation and the other things that are important to me, and of course, play games.
Well, I think now with, gaming and video games becoming so diverse, it will be easy for you to get your fix, whether it be history or, animals.
True.
As you play. So I don't necessarily think that streaming is going to be, apart from those type of things. I think it's pretty inclusive. And I think you realize that as well. That's why you decided to, venture a bit further into it.
Oh, definitely.
So, talking about, the Wildlife Ranch, what are some like the most difficult things you and family have had to endure over the years when it comes to not only your farm, but conservation in general when it comes to animals?
Well, putting the lockdown aside, because obviously that's a major blow to us. We are a tourism-based facility. We don't receive any payment from the government whatsoever, fully privately funded. So putting that aside, I would say a lot of the other difficulties we've had, many zoological facilities face public backlash in terms of, I think, a lot of ignorance from people. And I think especially like zoos in general, and we're not actually a zoo. So we sometimes call ourselves a zoo because we kind of fall in between. We're a mix between an open space conservation facility and a zoo. We don't have the traditional zoo elements. We don't have traditional park elements. So that's why we kind of call ourselves a wildlife ranch, but we're a bit of a mix. So one thing that we do, which is fairly controversial these days, is animal encounters where people can come and touch animals. And I can understand the controversy because there are many places that abuse their animals into this lifestyle. They drug them or they beat them in training or anything along those lines, or they force the poor animal into it. And people unwittingly, or maybe just out of greed or ignorance or whatever, they'll just go in and they'll touch these animals. And you think about places like the Tiger Temple and such. So there definitely are places where it should be banned, and I think that more regulation should be implemented. However, I don't think it should be blanket banned, and that's where I think we're different. Our facility puts animals first at all times. So when people come in, so someone arrives at our facility and they want to touch for example, a cheetah or maybe a serval or a snake, anything along those lines. We we have a whole protocol set up. So the first thing we do is obviously we check the height of the visitor, we check their age, we check their general, can they understand what we're saying? Are they able to follow instructions? We assess everything. We make sure their hands are clean, all of that. We then send our trained keepers in to assess our animals. How are the animals feeling today? Do they look irritated? Are they tired? Do they not want to be around people? And it's very easy to tell because cheetahs purr. Cheetahs are the only big cats that purr. So they're easy to tell. If they don't want to be around people, they'll let you know. They just won't purr, or they'll move away, or they'll hiss, anything like that. So we check, and we send our people in who work with these animals daily and know their behavior. If the cheetah is fine, we say, okay, we'll bring the person in and the encounter will begin. If it's apparent the cheetah is not fine, we say, sorry, no encounter today, animal's not in the mood. And that's, I think, already just a key difference. Another key difference is when we bring people in, now we give them a safety briefing first. We give them a full safety briefing first. They're not allowed to touch the animal in certain places. They're not allowed to move quickly. They're not allowed to approach it from a space that will make it uncomfortable. Nothing. We've got animal behaviorists and everything. We fully research exactly how you can interact with an animal for its maximum comfort. And even if during the encounter, while you're busy touching the animal, it decides it doesn't want to be there anymore, sorry, end of encounter. If you want to refund, that's fine. The animal's first. But the whole point of our encounter relationship is to build that relationship, is to make people realize that this animal is more than something that you can just see from a distance or on your TV. It's a living, breathing thing, and it needs our help because we have damaged the world. We have damaged their ecology. You need to create this connection so you can understand it. In the same way that humans, we're very tactile. We need to understand, we need to touch, we need to feel. And this is a great way to do that. So when you have a lemur sitting on your shoulder and you're seeing it and you're encountering it, or you're looking into the eyes of a cheetah, it's a whole different experience to just seeing it from a distance. And we've felt that this has actually worked. We've had multiple people come back to us over the years saying things like, you've changed the way I see things. I'm going to do my bit to help. My son wants to grow up to be a zoologist, all this stuff. So we think we've done right. And as far as we're concerned, if it's going to be done right, we're doing it right. And I know that sounds arrogant, but I think we've proven ourselves over the years, especially considering we've had no serious injuries or anything like that. So, and you hear about that all the time in South Africa, people walking with lions or anything like that. I don't endorse walking with lions. I don't endorse that one guy, what's his name, the lion whisperer. I think he's setting a really bad precedent, all those kind of places. But there are places that do it well. And I think that if we adopt a more wholesome model that the government could then maybe enforce, that would be better. But instead of a complete blanket ban. But unfortunately, we sometimes get a lot of flack from the public as a result. But we talk to them, we try and educate them, and we invite them to come and see what we do. And usually, if they do come and see what we do, they change their minds. And in some cases, just by talking to them online, we also change their minds. So that's the one difficulty. Another difficulty, another major difficulty is operational things like food costs, weather, storms, floods, animal diseases, especially cheetahs. They're prone to getting kidney disease and such or kidney failure from their genetics. What else? Breeding mishaps. There's a lot of things that can go wrong, but we've learned over the years how to deal with that for the most part. So we run fairly smoothly.
Yeah, I can imagine after Tiger King showed on Netflix, you guys might have got even a bigger flood of those people.
Yeah, you'd actually be surprised. We haven't really had much negativity from places like Tiger King, I suppose, because it coincided with lockdown. So, but.
I suppose. We
don't really want people arriving and going, "Ooh, I want this place to be." I want this to be another Tiger King, because I quite frankly, find that the facilities featured in Tiger King have received something like 700% increase in visitors since the Netflix documentary, which I think is disgusting. But what do I know?
I think it's an important distinction. Me over the years, obviously I liked places like zoos and SeaWorld and that when I was a kid, because it's all wondrous and fun.
Of course,
and
you're a kid, you don't know any better.
Yeah, and then over the years you're like, okay, are we actually is subjugating these animals for entertainment? Where the ethics in that? And then you start thinking that way. Okay, no, then we need to keep no animals, and then you start thinking about it even further. Then you realize, okay, some animals, once you keep them in captivity, you can't just put them back and expect them to survive. And some animals that are maimed in some way that would not survive in the wild. Where are they going to go? If you're gonna throw them out, then they're going to get eaten the next day. So
we take in, for example, injured animals as well. Like we have a Cape vulture exhibit where we take in vultures that have injured themselves, either been shot at or they've flown into power lines, various things like that. So
yeah, and the thing you guys are doing with the cheetahs, it's a problem, that there's not a lot of them around. So having this genetic stock that you can try and replenish later, that's important, because we went and we as humans destroyed a lot of the environment, so there are ways we are trying to fix that, and some of that is having breeding programs.
I think the problem is, I agree. I think the problem is that that it's not black and white. We can't just say all zoos or no zoos. It's very gray.
It's gray.
And like anything that we've been involved in, we've made it messy and complicated. So it's not as simple as just end zoos and let nature take its course, because it doesn't work like that. People ask us, why can't we just release our cheetahs into the wild? And we say there is no wild to release them into. There are everywhere is an enclosure now. We could do Kruger Park, but they've got very particular population densities there. You can't just mess with that. We can't just release them where farmers are either, because farmers sometimes see them as nuisances and will kill them, thinking that they kill their livestock. So it's not a simple, that's just cheetah. There's so many other animals that have similar issues. And, there's deforestation, there's tons of things. So we could go on forever about that. But point is, I think there's a very strong case for zoos and conservation facilities if they're done right.
Yeah, in a certain context, that is more helpful than just entertainment. But but when you have to think about it, okay, where's the money going to come from? And I think that's why it kind of tumbles into this thing where the entertainment value takes more precedence over, and that's the actual problem. Is that
it is, and then if you lose sight and make the entertainment aspect the most important aspect, then That being said, it's when I visited SeaWorld when I was younger, I was lucky enough to, and I got a stuffed toy because I used to love Flipper. Flipper the dolphin was my hero when I was a kid, and I got two stuffed toys when I was there. I got one of Flipper the dolphin and one of an orca. And I had those stuffed toys with me until I was like 15, and they got destroyed by the dog. But I remember seeing those animals, and I was so taken by them that I had to have these things, and I've carried them in my heart ever since, so to speak. And I can only think that similar people have, other people have similar experiences, but at the same time, had I known that those animals probably aren't happy, they might be very depressed in those tanks, I would have thought differently about it. I think that certain, even if it's important to have people have that connection, I don't think it's right to, for example, sacrifice a pot of dolphins in a tiny tank for our entertainment just so that we can create a connection, so that we stop destroying the world. I think that certain animals can do well in captivity, and if they can, and they're also endangered, then if you could give them a good quality of life, sure, we can go that route. But I think if they're naturally not inclined to captivity and never will be, I don't think that is something we should look at, really. So
it's definitely a case by case basis thing.
Very much so.
And I agree with you. You can't just shut everything down. We did a lot of damage to the environment, and a lot of it needs to be fixed. But the thing is, we are still here. Like, we can't just erase ourselves off the planet.
Yeah, exactly.
And I think that's kind of the problem, when it comes to these real, like, hardcore activists. and you need those people because they're the ones that start, just and get the conversation going. But sometimes you can also get extremist on the one side where you do not see that, okay, there's things going on that it's not that simple.
We've had that, unfortunately. We've had our fair share of activists, and in fact, we had a poisoning incident back in, I think, 2003, where someone poisoned several of our cheetahs. They threw poison into our enclosure and killed about, I think, 3 or 4 cheetahs, including one I had personally hand raised. I still get a bit emotional when I think about it.
Yeah, no, that's ridiculous, man.
We're pretty sure it was an activist who had been harassing us for a while about releasing our animals and refused to understand why and how we could not release them, and instead decided that death through poisoning was a better alternative. We never managed to catch that person, and as a result of what happened, we got a CCTV system donated to us. So that was wonderful. We set that up, and we've never had an incident since. But it was a hard lesson to learn. We just kind of assumed that people would be good, but apparently not.
Bloody hell. Okay, let's just try to get onto more lighthearted stuff. It's going to
sorry about that.
No, it's interesting. It's definitely a conversation that I don't think happens often enough, because especially in the kind of media world that we're living now, the extreme type of things tend to get, overinflated and get presented to the public. But obviously what's actually happening in reality is more of like, what's going on in the center, and not enough of that gets discussed. So I'm glad to provide a platform for that type of thing. Because those discussions take time, and you have to be able to present your argument in different ways so that people can see it from different perspectives. Which is very difficult, in the short news cycles that you get that people, consume.
Yeah.
But let's get back to video gaming and live streaming. So once you started, with your efforts to raise money, you decided, okay, this might be an interesting thing to do. So why did you then continue, live streaming video games, and what do you like about it? What don't you like about it? What's your experience?
I mean, I've been a gamer since I was old enough, I suppose, to own a console. I think I'm trying to remember now. I think I'm trying to remember if I had a Game Boy before I had a Sega. But I think what happened was that there was a point when my parents were traveling a lot for business, and I was their only child, so they took me with. I wasn't their only child at the time. No, I'm thinking much later. It was actually later. I was old enough to travel with them. My younger siblings weren't. So my siblings would stay behind and be looked after. I would go with my parents, and they would give me a Game Boy to occupy myself. So that was, I was hooked. And I still remember, even before that, I used to play on my mom's computer. I used to play DOS games, all that. So I've been a gamer since day one.
Wait, before you continue, what were you playing on DOS?
Teddy Bear Picnic, and then eventually things like Prince of Persia, all those other good stuff, the good old DOS games.
Yeah, Prince of Persia, which would eventually evolve into Assassin's Creed.
Yeah, right. I mean, I've always played. So then it's funny because even though I was such a big gamer, I never really watched streams. I always thought, I watched highlights and things, the occasional hilarious thing. But I was like, if I'm going to play a game, I'd rather just play the game. I don't want to watch someone else playing the game. So I never really got into streaming. And then around the time when we wanted to raise some funds, I remember a streaming friend of mine was raising funds for the SPCA. I was like, wait a second, maybe we could do the same thing for our facility. And then, got from there. And then the first time we did the conservation streamers event, I was just running support. So I just had to quickly learn how Twitch worked. I spent like a good few weeks on people's streams, learning how you could share emojis and how you could jump between streams, all that stuff. And then on the day, during the weekend of the event, I just was jumping between streams, sharing information, sharing widgets, all that stuff. And then after all that, I had such a blast, and the community was so great that I decided that if we're going to do this again, I need to get not into stream, but I need to do a stream or two myself on Twitch to figure out how it works so that I can be better support next time. So I just did I think I did 2 or 3 streams in the space of a week. And I enjoyed it so much. I had such a good time that I decided, no, I'm going to actually do this. I want to be a streamer. Not necessarily for a career just yet, but it's definitely something fun I want to be doing. And then I actually participated in our second fundraiser, and I did a 24-hour stream myself, and that was deadly. I don't recommend it to anyone.
No.
I'm not maybe 12-hour blocks, but never, and I see a lot of actually my streamer friends are doing 24 hours, so good luck to them. But I just enjoyed the overall experience, the community, being able to talk about the things I love about history, animals, having people pop into the chat and share their life stories and talk to us about, things. And it helps that my partner in crime is not only a mod in my channel, but she's also a military historian like me. So when we start talking military history, we get this lovely flow going in the chat, and it's wonderful. She's also doing her PhD actually, so we've been tag teaming on. I lie. She's actually been supporting me completely because I'm useless at my PhD, so she's just been propping me up. But
that's pretty cool.
So I got into streaming as a result of that, and I was looking at growing it a lot now, but I decided to pull back a bit just to kind of focus on the PhD, and eventually I'll grow it more. But I should mention that this is my first foray into this area. I actually have an existing brand called Citizen Historian. That project or that brand is kind of on hiatus at the moment while I'm finishing the PhD because, again, it was taking up too much of my time. But it is my more academic brand. So I've done consulting under it. I've written for magazines under it. I write for The Armourer in the UK, which is a militaria collector's magazine. And I do a lot of other cool, more academic work through them. I wanted to start a YouTube channel eventually, which I will. I did a podcast for a little while, which I, again, have paused. So the LoFi Historian is more just the gaming side of that, which is something I can do for fun. I can keep the project in the back of my mind and in people's sites until I'm ready to push forward with both full steam. So
yeah, and it's still early days. It's not. I think it's too early for you to be like, okay, I'm gonna go all in on this all of a sudden. It's I find when it comes to content creation, like it's just slow and steady, adding things, week by week, month by month, until you pick it up. Unless you do something like what you did, where you have a learned academic history, and then you can do something extremely professional like citizen science and citizen historian.
Citizen historian,
citizen science. My friends.
That's not a bad brand name either, though.
Well, my friends have a citizen science company. It's called Argonaut Science, but they're biologists. Yeah, I think that's why in my brain citizen science went first. So for sure. I actually. In my brain, I didn't realize, you have a citizen historian and then you got a lo-fi historian, which are two separate things. But I do like, the fact that, what I'm planning to do, and I think what you're kind of planning to do as well, is like use our streams also as a platform for education, but in a fun way,
Definitely.
Like trying to teach while not teaching, not having, it's a way we can communicate knowledge, but in a way that's not a classroom.
Yes.
And I think that's kind of really important this day and age where people are so used to, that quick hits of dopamine and like short attention span type of thing.
Yeah.
And, sitting in the classroom and learning about things is not the most fun way to actually, unless you're so passionate about it in the first place. Like I had this discussion with Francois Noda, super teacher, who's like he's a science education academic. So he's he does science on how to teach science.
Oh, wonderful!
It's a kind of a brain twister. But we both kind of came to this, conclusion that it's in this day and age, like actually school might be detrimental, if you're trying to become like a proper functioning adult in modern society and in future society, because the world is so rapidly changing. School might not be, and the way knowledge is presented at school these days or in the past, is not the optimal way, and it is changing and it is getting better. But obviously, when it comes to large institutions, it takes a while, and it takes a while for people to change.
I agree with that. I used to lecture at Stellenbosch University. I was lecturing. I was doing a war and society course. And for me, like I love teaching. I love public speaking. I love that whole thing. I love teaching history, especially. And I was very big on telling a story. That was how I wanted to bring it across. So I didn't want them to memorize facts. I wanted them to basically I told them, I said, so if you guys like a movie, let's take Lord of the Rings, right? You watch Lord of the Rings and you enjoy it so much that you learn the characters' names. But maybe you go further. You want to learn more about the characters. So you start looking up the lore on the character, or you read the book it's based on, etc. And that's what I want to do here. I want to tell you a story, and it's up to you to decide how much you like it, bearing in mind that in some cases you have to like it because there's a test coming up. Yeah. But the idea is that I want to teach it in that way. And I was the only historian I knew in the department. And in fact, I still don't think it happens. I would bring artifacts to the class. Now, granted, you can't, like, if you're teaching, I don't know, the Hiroshima bombings, you can't bring a bomb in with you. But I was teaching certain aspects of military history, and I brought in an old Zulu spear. I brought in a sword. I brought in various items. I brought in things that people could touch and see. I brought in a helmet, things like that. And I brought a proper soldier's they call them Stahldacher, steel helmet, and I got one of those students to come in. I said, here, put this on, and he put it on, and he realized how heavy it was. And I said, okay, now run back and forth up and down the class 10 times as fast as you can with that on, and don't drop it. And he was running and running and running. And afterwards I said, so how did that feel? And he's like, no, it was heavy. It was bobbing around. I'm like, okay, now imagine doing that, but also put on a 25 kilogram pack. Don't have eaten for like a day or two, and run a good 15 kilometers while under fire and with the sun going. And that's an idea of what these kind of people had to go through awareness. That's teaching aids. And I'm lucky enough that I can do that with history. Not everyone can do that, but I think we as educators, if I want to be so bold, need to find new ways, as you've said, to educate people. And I think that traditional institutions like universities have their place, but I think sitting in a lecture hall and being droned at, especially by people from a previous generation who have a wealth of knowledge, but don't know how to impart it beyond, let me just pour information out onto you. Here's a poorly done slideshow, and deal with it. Because in fact, if you actually if you read the history about how our education system has come about, it's rooted in turn of the century factory expansionism, industrialization. Yep. You put workers into space, fill them with stuff, shake them down in the line, push them out into society, and rinse and repeat. Yeah. That way doesn't work. Our society is far more organic now. It's the same reason why we also have interdisciplinary studies going on, because we need a more gray area mixing going on. Our universities need to evolve. I'm actually thinking in some way that lockdown is kind of a silver lining in that way, because now all these lecturers and universities have to get creative. They can no longer force people into study halls. You have to figure out ways to share information online and different methods and all of that. So, but I also think a lot of the onus is up to students. They need to get more creative in the way that they engage with the information. They mustn't be passive learners. They can't just sit there and go, the old man's talking again, blah, blah, blah. They need to take an interest and decide if they want to learn this or not, and how they're going to learn it. I mean, my biggest way of learning was to, even if I didn't enjoy the subject that much, I would try and learn about it from every angle I could. I would read the books. I would watch the documentaries. I would go to the museums, whatever it was, and engage in the information. And I would learn, in some cases, even though I'm engaged, I don't actually like it that much, but I'll learn it for the exam. In other cases, I was like, wow, I love this. I want to learn more about it. And I would keep going. And so you got to be more active in your own education, I think.
Yeah. I agree. And it's difficult, I think, in this day and age. I think, you probably can go back and listen to that podcast, because we talked about it quite a bit. It will be out this week, but I think it's also a point of, okay, how we present this stuff to the kids, and why, like, what are the outcomes and why things were set up in a certain way, and then you realize, okay, the way that school and university teach is for the kids to pass an exam, not necessarily for the kids to learn. and be engaged.
I hate exams. Don't get me started. I hate them so much.
Yeah, so that was our main point on that type of stuff.
Yeah.
But speaking about, facts and things you need to know, not necessarily for exams, but things that you just like to know. So what are some of your favorite historical facts throughout history that not many people might know about?
Well, I mean, there are so many, but there was one in particular that I thought might be fun for this show, and it's one of my favorite historical facts, just because it's absolutely hilarious. So it's I mean, I don't know if you've heard about it, because there's been stories recently being published about it. It crops up every few years. It does the rounds. But at one point in I believe it was the 90s, Pepsi, the cola company, owned a flotilla of warships, and actually became, if I remember correctly, I think they were the sixth or seventh biggest naval fleet at the time.
Is it?
Yeah. So what had happened was that the Soviet Union, after it kind of started brokering deals with the US after World War II, and even during the Cold War, they started brokering trade deals and all of that. And at one point, apparently the envoy to the US from the Soviet Union were given Pepsi as like a drink. And this is just after, a lot of embargoes and things like that. So for them, it was a novelty. They tried it and they loved it so much that they started importing it into Russia, and they started getting it, sold there. And at the time, the Soviet Union, the way they paid for it to Pepsi was vodka. So they gave vodka in exchange for Pepsi to Pepsi, and Pepsi then repackaged and sold that vodka. But then towards the collapse of the Soviet Union in about 89, 90, they suddenly didn't have money to continue paying for Pepsi. But they wanted Pepsi. They're one of the biggest Pepsi drinkers in the world, if not the biggest. So in exchange, they ran out of vodka. They couldn't pay anymore in that way. So they gave them 17 submarines, a cruiser, a frigate, and a destroyer.
Bloody hell.
So there was Pepsi, for the briefest of moments, became one of the top naval military forces in the world. So I mean, I find that incredible. And then they actually, and then people ask what happened afterwards. So Pepsi then took those ships, and they didn't, start a war or anything. They sold them to a Swedish scrap company. And then they scrapped and repurposed those. But I love the
functioning, idea. Like military vehicle. They just scrapped them. Interesting.
Yeah. So, I mean, I find that, because, again, I focus on the Cold War. So it's one of my favorite facts, just because of how absolutely crazy it is. That era, the Cold War era, was mad.
It's amazing.
And that, to me, just kind of is the cherry on top, because 1990 is more or less when the Cold War ended. So that is just boom. That says everything about that era to me.
You could probably have like a whole podcast series just about the Cold War, like just by itself.
Dude, there's so many already. There are tons of Cold War podcasts. I think I'd love to do maybe a podcast on the weirder aspects of the Cold War, things that people don't know about. I mean, there's lots of, like, history has tons of very little interesting stories. There's, if we go from Pepsi and global war down to like an individual person. There's this one story I know of. It's been confirmed, where it was a special forces operator. It was in Angola, and he was diving in a river with a group of other special forces men, and they were trying to blow up a bridge. And while they were swimming towards this bridge, a crocodile came out of nowhere and grabbed the one guy right between the legs, just grabbed him and started doing like a death roll in the water. And this special forces guy, panicking obviously because he has a crocodile, but also remembered his training, I guess, pulls out a knife and starts jabbing at the crocodile, punching it and stabbing it and everything. And eventually the crocodile lets it go. But because they're in enemy territory, they've now been spotted. So all the noise and the screaming, there's these Angolan guards or Cuban guards standing on this bridge, seeing this commotion. They start, firing, and the people get missed. But I believe they did manage to blow up the bridge in the end. And the operator who got attacked by the crocodile survived, but they got scattered as a result of that whole chaos. And I just, again, it's another little weird story from kind of that era. I mean, there's tons of like little interesting facts. There's a lot of things that people don't know about various historical figures. I mean, pick a person, you'll find something interesting and different about them. Pick an aspect of history. And we're also learning new things all the time. That's what's great about history. It's actually always evolving. People often think that history is static. That you learn, for example, you learn something about, the Queen of England or Queen Victoria from 1800s or whatever. Sorry, I don't know British history that well. So I think Queen Victoria is actually 1900s. But point is that you can learn something brand new from uncovering a new document or finding, a chiseled slab or whatever you might find. You'll find something new, or even new information. Like I think the Dead Sea Scrolls, for the longest time, they were thought to be authentic. But just recently, some brand new technology has uncovered evidence that actually they're all very clever forgeries.
Interesting.
But not forgeries from our time. That's the interesting thing. They're kind of authentic in their age, but they're not authentic that they're actual biblical documents. So,
interesting. There's kind of this saying that I like, is that history always tends to repeat itself. So as a historian, do you actually find this to be somewhat true, or is it overblown?
Yeah, so this is, I guess, where my psychology training comes in a bit. So history does and doesn't repeat itself. The thing is that we're humans and we've evolved certain traits. We have certain behaviors. We adhere to certain patterns. Obviously, you as a marine biologist will understand the behavior of animals, and they're fairly predictable. Humans, obviously, are a very complex social species, but we have very distinct archetypes, very distinct behaviors that have stayed with us throughout most of our development and have somewhat changed in the past couple of hundred years due to our societal development and industry. But overall, the overarching feel is still there. We're very subjected to mob justice, mob think, all that kind of stuff. So there are definitely patterns. One of my favorite ones I saw recently where people were freaking out about phones, about computer screens, and especially about 5G. So the big one, 5G, right, is the new evil. So someone shared this brilliant image I saw where it was taken from a newspaper from, I believe it was 1899, when electricity was first becoming widely used in street lamps. And the image was a cartoon of everyone dying from under these street lamps because there was a genuine fear that electricity would kill you just by virtue of you being near it.
Yeah.
So that shows that 100 years ago or 120 years ago, the exact same fears were present. And not only that, in my psychology, my boredom chapter of my thesis, I talk about graffiti. And we have graffiti dating back to pre-Roman times. We have graffiti dating back to Viking times. There's this. Here's another fun historical fact that also illustrates my point. There's a cave, I believe it is in either the north of France or it's or somewhere thereabout, where a group of archaeologists were doing excavation things, and then they saw up very high in the ceiling was a collection of runes. And they couldn't reach it without like special equipment and all of that. So it took them like a month to eventually get up there safely. A person could potentially scale it, but they had to do it safely. So they finally get up there and they take these runes and they translate them. And all it says is, Olaf was here. It's very high. So here's an ancient Viking rune from the 1100s. Just a guy just like, I was here. And I mean, you see tons of we have Kilroy was here in World War II. So you know what, history, I'm just talking about like incidents like that. But if we just look at things like empires rising and falling, a big one is, so the Easter Island civilization as well as Great Zimbabwe are two very good examples, and Stonehenge are three very good examples of how civilizations used all the available forest and landscape in the area for their growth of their civilization and promptly collapsed because they overused it. Easter Island cut down all the trees. Great Zimbabwe did the same with the forest and tilled the land. I think there was evidence that parts of the pre-Mayan civilization or pre-Incan civilization did the same thing. The people of Stonehenge did the same thing. So we are now seeing the same thing. We have again as a global society now, collapsed our ecology and our resource base. And we're reaping the rewards of that, which is collapse effectively. So in that regard, we have done the exact same thing that almost every civilization has done up until this point, just now on a global scale. So we've repeated ourselves over and over. And you know what? I'm thinking that we're still going to survive this. We're a very tenacious species. And if we get out there into the wider universe and we start colonizing places like Mars and asteroid belts and all of that, there's definitely going to be aspects of our ecology that's going to go with it. Our behavior will definitely evolve new traits on these new planets and in these new environments. But I think that it's not unlikely that we'll have this kind of bell curve of growth and collapse continuously, depending on what happens. I think that's just the nature of our species. It's not necessarily a bad thing. We just need to find a way to do it that's ecologically friendly, I believe. And maybe by finding that way of making it ecologically friendly, there won't be a collapse. Instead, we'll reach homeostasis. One can only hope.
Indeed. I have hope, because I kind of back humanity that we're smart enough, to get out of this hole that we put ourselves into when it comes to our ecology. Because the thing is, like, we were smart enough to put ourselves there in the first place. So it's just, I think it's going to take some ingenuity. It's going to take some way of getting us all to work together. That's the actual problem.
I agree.
Getting everybody to work towards a common goal, especially because of, all the political rhetoric that goes around that kind of tends to push people apart. I think that's one of our great downfalls as a civilization.
I think right now, because we're in a situation where for the first time ever we have a global information network and we are not beholden to the authority figures for our information anymore. So we're seeing a big shift in politics and in government and in the way people want to be governed. And again, that's part of the pattern, including like French Revolution, all that, where the people rise up. But whenever the people have risen up and overthrown, someone else has just come and put themselves on top. For the first time, we're now self-aware of it. We can see it. We're now discussing, peasants over here are discussing with peasants over there in real time and saying, hey, do you realize the king is doing this? Oh, wow, yeah, he's doing that. And remember that last group of peasants that overthrew? They also had a king that did the same thing. We're for the first time, we have power to reconcile what has happened in the past with what's happening now and what might happen in the future. We, as lay people, have access to experts and politicians in a way that's unprecedented. So the existing structures that we've had for the past few hundred years of one person at the top and all the trickle down that comes from it is starting to unravel, because it cannot work in a society that values egalitarian knowledge and rights. So we're going to be seeing a big change. We're in a revolution of epic proportions that is very slowly coming forward.
Yeah. Speaking of French Revolution, it reminds me of Assassin's Creed Unity. So I'm wondering, being a historian, what are some of your favorite video games that kind of highlight historical knowledge and facts?
Well, I mean, there are a lot of games. I mean, most historical games out there obviously focus on battle, action, that kind of thing. So, and I mean, I'm no saint. I love myself some of those kind of games. So, I'll play Battlefield, I'll play Call of Duty, that kind of thing. But we're seeing now a really, really interesting change in many of these games. So I think, personally for me, the original Assassin's Creed, I think, is my favorite historical game. Even though all the Assassin's Creed games obviously play fairly loose with history, and of course, I mean, they kind of have alien artifacts and going in time through your DNA, all that crap. But in terms of historical accuracy for the time period, excluding the story elements, I think Assassin's Creed is just one of the most incredible achievements in that regard. They've done very well in a lot of their other games, and I absolutely love the new 2 Assassin's Creed games where they give you that tour of Egypt and tour of ancient Greece. Love it. I will say that I was a bit annoyed to find out a while ago that Ubisoft was censoring Grecian statues that had penises and things like that, which is absolutely ridiculous. I think there was an outcry and they've uncensored it. I'm not 100% sure. But I think if you're going to go far enough to show art and history, you got to show it as it is. You can't, pull away from it. But that's a whole separate discussion. But I love it. I love them for doing that, because Assassin's Creed has always been very kind of historically orientated, which is great. And then, of course, again, like the Battlefield, Call of Duties. There's games like A Plague Tale, which is wonderful story-based game.
Plague Tale Innocence,
Sorry?
A Plague Tale Innocence.
Yes, that's it. Thank you. You got Rome Total War, Company of Heroes. We're seeing something very interesting. This Land Is My Land, which is also now, because most of the time we see a very kind of white Eurocentric narrative. This Land Is My Land. Unfortunately, the game seems to be suffering from lack of dev input to grow it. But the concept was very fascinating. And the idea was that you were a Apache warrior who was fighting colonial settlers who were coming into your land. It's like third person. So, it was almost Assassin's Creed, but you're now an Apache warrior attacking white settlers. So we're seeing a change in narrative as well from a lot of these things. We're seeing a lot of VR stuff. Dawn of Art is one of my favorites. It's just an experience, but you're inside a cave in France that has that big hand that's, painted onto the wall from like 130,000 years ago or something. Or maybe more, I think, actually. So a lot of VR experiences in history. There's another game that came out last year called 1111 Memories Retold, which was about the end of World War II. Another one which is fascinating, which I want to buy, is Tank Mechanic Simulator. So you take old World War II tanks and things, you can take them apart and put them back together. And I love old tanks. There's actually a couple of books I need to purchase at the moment. And I was lucky in Angola to go. I got to climb inside old Russian tanks and such that were sitting out on the battlefield for like 30 plus years. So it was fascinating for me. But yeah, so we're seeing some wonderful games out there. I would say I don't want to recommend any games that are historical per se, because it depends on your interest. If you like World War II, then Company of Heroes and early Call of Duty games are probably your best bet. If you like, even Battlefield 1, actually, I played it a while ago, and I liked the historical lead up it has.
Yeah,
very, very good, very good. So that is one thing. So it depends on your interest. If you like Rome, then Rome Total War is great. It really just depends on what you're into, but you'll find something anywhere. My big thing I say with all of it is take it all with a pinch of salt, because remember, and this is a big contention that pops up, and I try to I try not to insert myself into these arguments anymore, but it's the idea of historical accuracy, and people complain when Battlefield 1 came out and they saw that, you could play a guy with a peg leg or a woman with an eye patch or a black man in the military. People are freaking out because I call it, I've coined the term and it's on my blog. I call it hysterical accuracy. Because here are people who think they know history, and they will use it as a platform to insert their opinion about something, to assert their opinion. So no, there were never women in the military. This game is trash as a result. SJWs run amok, blah, blah, blah. There were never blacks in the military, etc. So, I made a whole post where I took several of the best comments that came out of that Battlefield thing, and I actually refuted each one of them, saying it's never as clear cut as, especially because a lot of the documentaries and things that you grow up seeing are from a particular narrative. So that's my point here. Take all documentaries, games, movies with a pinch of salt. They're never going to be 100% historically accurate, because it's impossible to be 100% historically accurate. There's too much gray area. We don't know enough. We can't assert things 100%. But games, movies, documentaries are all trying to tell a story from a particular narrative. So it would be like complaining about Lord of the Rings because there are too many hobbits in it, when the whole story is mostly from the hobbit's perspective, right?
Yeah.
So that's just what's going to be. So I can't go into Battlefield complaining that there's not enough representation of the colonial forces, because that's not the story they're trying to tell. I would like more representation. I really would. And hopefully there will be more. I would love an Assassin's Creed set in Africa. And whenever I bring this up online, people are like, there's no civilization in Africa. What are you talking about? So number one, immediately shows their ignorance, probably a lot of healthy dose of racism as well in there. But, there are so many civilizations, ancient civilizations, that an Assassin's Creed game in Africa could be set in. I only hope they do it one day. But again, fortunately, the gaming market is set in the Northern Hemisphere for the most part. So naturally, those are where the bigger games are going to sell. Like Assassin's Creed Valhalla is coming up, and people immediately complained because the trailer came out, and there a Viking was running on the beach, and he pulls out a hidden blade, like shoots out like and stabs someone, and people flip out. Historical accuracy! Vikings never had that. And like, dude, you're looking at a game where there are literally alien artifacts, and the Templars and Assassins have been fighting each other for years, and you're complaining about that? Come now. It was ridiculous. But anyway.
Talking about narratives, I don't know whether this is actually a narrative thing. I think it's probably part of that conversation, but there's just like this there's so much media about World War II when there's a whole other world war that you barely hear anything about. And I think I've only played 2 games. Like, I think Valiant Hearts and Battlefield 1 are the only World War I games that you get. I think it's got something to do with, the US not being that involved in World War I compared to 2. And that's where a lot of these games are being made and that type of thing. So what's your outlook on that?
Yeah. So, sorry. Before I do get into that, there's actually one more game I did want to mention, which I forgot to, and it's a brilliant game. It's called This War of Mine, which is an absolutely incredible game set more or less in kind of Cold War era European country, and it's about the perspective of survivors of a civil war. So that is one of my favorite games of all time. If you want to know the effects of war on populace, play that game. That's just a side thing. So. Yeah, you hit the nail on the head. The thing is that World War II is marketable because that's when we saw the most US involvement in a conflict. But not only that, World War II is more marketable because there was a great evil to defeat. World War I was just a tragedy. There was no great evil. Yeah, the Germans were trying to take land, but honestly, the World War I was just a giant balls up from the start. It was just. It was a mess. So it's just sad. No one wants to market World War I because it's too sad. That's why there are so few games and movies and things out. That being said, there's a slow but steady rise of World War I interest. People are now getting sick of World War II. World War I is becoming more interesting. We're seeing a few more movies coming out. We're seeing a few more games. It's going to be slow but sure, but there will be more about it. World War II, like I said, it's more marketable. There was the great evil, Hitler, right? Nazi Germany, the Nazis, the ultimate evil force. You want to punch a Nazi zombie in the face. You want to blow up Hitler. You want to whatever. And it also had some really, because it's where we saw a huge leap in innovation in terms of military technology. So we have all those crazy hidden weapons of the Nazis, moon rockets and all that crazy stuff. So there's tons that can be unpacked from World War II. And I mean, there's even the occult wings of the Nazis. They were trying to find ancient artifacts. It's crazy. So if that's, if you were looking for a war to market and just leech tons of content from, World War II is it. And especially if you are the US and you have a narrative that you won World War II. And that you came and saved the Allies and beat back the evil Nazis all by yourself. Rah, rah, USA, USA. Then that's the war that you go with. So I don't think we're ever going to not see a World War II game. And I don't think we're ever not going to see America portrayed as the hero. And don't get me wrong, the Americans did amazing work in World War II. If it wasn't for them, a lot of things would have been very different. Although I still think the Germans would have lost just based on the offensive from the Russians and from their own collapsing economy. But the Americans really pushed forward there. And there were some incredible and brave people, amazing strategies. I will never undersell how important they were to the war and what they did. But I think that they oversell their role, especially because most World War II movies, you only see American troops and the occasional British troop, whereas it was far more of a mix and even sometimes more British and French troops than American troops, depending. But and even other places like you had Norwegian troops and the colonies and all of that. So I think that the problem is even Band of Brothers, you get a very sanitized view of, or very whitewashed view of World War II through that. And the games especially. And of course, the game studios are made in... Look, the reason why half the Avengers movies are set in New York is because that's where you're going to get... America's where you're going to get a big portion of your sales. So it makes sense. Warner Brothers isn't going to put out an epic, huge movie about a colonial soldier in Zimbabwe who never leaves Zimbabwe. You know what I mean? He's going to stay there. So that being said, every now and again, you do get a breakout movie that is about someone or something in a different place. And it just depends. So I can only hope that the more interest gets out there, the more we'll see new narratives. And we're seeing a lot of historians, a lot of academics. Again, my significant other is one of those who's studying colonial soldiers, specifically people of color from South Africa who fought in World War II. So we're seeing some incredible work coming out of the academic circles. And once those start to filter into the public consciousness, we'll see some more rise in interest, I think.
I think we had a pretty interesting, insightful chat so far. We probably could go on for hours about this type of stuff.
Easily.
But I think we'll end on this one thing. What type... Okay, let's put it this way. What historical item would you like to be discovered right now that you would be so happy if they went and found this somewhere?
Oh, discovered. Let's see. I mean, I can tell you something that I've always wanted in my personal collection, which has already been found. But it's called the Geographia Cosmographia, which was made by Ptolemy back in 100 AD. Ooh, and basically it's this book that's just maps. I love maps. I'm very keen on maps. You can tell I've got things like that going on. Yeah. And I love how people viewed the world back then. And, so that for me would be something I would kill to have in my collection. I think that book went for, what was it? I think something like $31 or $3.1 million to a collector. Geez. So I can only hope I can afford one of those one day. But I think what I would love, so even though I study modern history, I have a bit of a love affair with ancient history. I love the period where humans were first really eking out their existence in Africa, in Europe, when we were basically encountering the Neanderthals for the first time. So I love that era, and I love learning about that. Just as a side thing. So I think something I would love, we don't know much about it because there's so little preserved from that time. The stone tools they used may have shattered. The wooden tools they've used would have degraded. They left no art or history behind besides what was painted on walls.
Yeah.
I would love for something to be found, a record of some kind from that era, whether it's a rolled up sheepskin that just has scribblings on it or something that gives us a proper insight into how people thought and felt at that time, even if it's just a snapshot of some, Neanderthals in France, something like that. And if I come a bit further out, my ancestry is Viking, and I love the Viking histories, the Norse. We actually, a lot of people, so here's a piece of pop culture information. Most people don't realize that we actually know almost nothing about the actual Vikings. What we do know comes from Christian monk scholars 300 years later, because the Vikings didn't really keep proper records. We have the occasional record, but not really much. We have poetic eddas. We have things carved on rocks. We don't have much, though, in the way of proper historical records. And what was written about them from these monks' perspectives was mostly negative, because obviously, these were people who had pillaged them and stolen and killed and robbed. So we don't have much in the way. So I would love some kind of something to be unearthed. Again, being a historian, I want a record, I want an archive, I want something, but I want a proper document written from their perspective that explains their culture, explains their beliefs, explains things about them. Or even just translate some runes for us, something. That would be I think the things I would love to have. And as you can tell, they're all book related. I'm a huge bookophile. I don't have it here, but in my prize possessions in my household, I have a couple of artifacts I picked up from the years. I have World War I aviation goggles. I have a tank eyepiece from a Soviet tank, and I have a collection of old books. I think my oldest is about 200 years old. I have a first edition Jules Verne, Journey to the Center of the Earth. I have 10,000 Leagues Under the Sea. I have an original edition of Lord of the Rings, Two Towers, things like that. I love collecting old books, and I really want to. I also have a collection. It's called South African forces in France. So South Africans sent a significant contingent to France in World War II. They fought in Delville Wood. And this book, first edition as well, a first-hand account of their experiences there. So again, one of my prized possessions. But
That's
so
cool.
books.
Yeah, bibliophile maximum.
Big time.
All right. So, and with that, Garrett, I think it's time for us to pack up this camp and head off back to our respective labs and or fancy worlds. But first,
Definitely.
Garrett, why don't you let our fellow explorers know where they can find you and your work on the internet?
Yes, wonderful. So you can find me on Twitter at LoFi, LoFi _historian. So LoFi _historian. You can also find me on Facebook under either, again, LoFi Historian or The Citizen Historian. On Facebook it's just Citizen Historian. My website is thecitizenhistorian.com. I don't use Facebook all that much these days, so if you want to find updates from me, your best bet is Twitter. And my website at the moment has some great articles on it, and it showcases my research. So if you want to take a look, you can. It is also currently on pause while I'm completing the PhD, but as soon as I'm done with it, the website's going to pick up again. And eventually we'll be launching a YouTube channel. So if you really want to interact with me, Twitter, my main website, and of course you can find me on Twitch also at LoFi Historian.
Cool. Thank you so much, Garrett, for joining me today. I think it's been a really fun chat, and thank you to the listeners for listening and sparing your time. Hope you had fun learning with us today. Do keep safe, keep well, stay healthy, stay tuned, and cheers.
Bye.